It is indeed a real pleasure to be here this afternoon to remember and recognise the service given by New Zealand and Australian nurses who have so admirably represented their countries down the years. And in particular, I just want to pause at this juncture and acknowledge the amazing work of the Nurses Memorial Centre that's been on this site since 1948 and does such wonderful work. Events like today don't just happen. My understanding is this was about 6 months in the making, so for all those that have been part of making today happen, thank you and congratulations on a fabulous event. When Murray first approached me to speak on the topic of the joint military service history of New Zealand and Australian nurses, my initial thought was, that sounds fantastic, I'd love to do it. Closely followed by, that's an area I know just about nothing about. So I'm going to go and see what I can find out. And what struck me as I tried to educate myself was that as I began to scratch the surface, I noticed how, compared to other service personnel, the history of nursing is something of an untold story. Sure, there are a number of individual nurses whose stories are very well known, and you'll know them better than I, but the narrative that encompasses the nursing effort more broadly seemed to be missing. So, to try and understand this a little bit more, I went back to where the Anzac story began. Gallipoli, World War I, 1915, or in actual fact, just before that fateful day. Take it back to August 1914, which was when the British, to whom New Zealand was intrinsically bound at that time, declared war on Germany. The New Zealand Army Nurses Service had yet to be formed, but by October 1914, over 400 nurses had volunteered for service. Unfortunately, their service was unable to be accepted because the Defence Act hadn't been amended to allow it. It was clear that the authorities at the time had, in their wisdom, decided that no nurses were going to be required for overseas service. But unsurprisingly, the nurses weren't going to stand for that. And so on 31st of December, a deputation met with the then New Zealand Minister of Defence, the Honourable James Allen. The group comprised of a Dr. Marshall MacDonald, who was the president of the Dunedin branch of the New Zealand Trained Nurses Association, a Miss Holford, a Miss McLean, and 3 nurses who had served in the Boer War. Each nurse had their say in turn, and it appears as a result of their persuasiveness, there was a bit of a turning point. All the Honourable James Allen said at the time was, until the mother country asks us to provide nurses, it would be almost a presumption to send them. But the meeting must have had a deeper impact, because at the end of the meeting he immediately cabled the War Office and offered the service of 50 New Zealand nurses. He also sent a cable to the Prime Minister of Australia at the time, Andrew Fisher, and asked him that if reinforcements were to be sent to the front, that he consider the inclusion of some New Zealand nurses. And so on the 25th of March 1915, a cable was received back, asking for 12 nurses and for them to be ready to sail on the 31st of March 1915. The nurses who were selected sailed from Wellington aboard a vessel called the Illawarra, and from Australia on the 13th of April 1915 as members of the Australian Army Nursing Service. Interesting to note that these nurses were attested to the NZANS, and on arrival in Australia were attested again to serve with the AANS. Therefore, these nurses were attested to 2 countries at the one time. And given that we gather here on the eve of Anzac Day and in the shadow of commemorations that will mark the centenary of Anzac, it seems appropriate that we take a look back at the conditions that would have greeted both the soldiers and the nurses on that peninsula so far away, and why it's so important to the ongoing legacy of the Anzac relationship that our 2 nations share. 25th of April, as we've heard, 1915, 8 months into the Great War, as it was known, Allied soldiers landed on the shores of the Gallipoli Peninsula. This was Turkish territory, formed part of Germany's ally, the Ottoman Empire. The troops were there as part of a plan to open the Dardanelles Strait to the Allied fleet, allowing them to threaten the Ottoman capital, Constantinople, and, it was hoped, force a Turkish surrender. The Allied forces encountered unexpectedly strong resistance from the Turks, and as we've already heard, both sides suffered enormous loss of life. The forces from New Zealand and Australia, fighting under the Anzac banner for the first time, played an important part in the Gallipoli campaign. At its beginning, people at home greeted with excitement the news that our boys were at last fully engaged in the war. Anzac soldiers undoubtedly distinguished themselves with their courage and skill, establishing an enduring bond with the mates they fought alongside, regardless of which country they were from. As we heard earlier though, the Gallipoli campaign was a costly failure for the Allies, who after 9 months abandoned it and evacuated their surviving troops, and the numbers we heard earlier this afternoon pay testament to that. The communities they came from counted the cost in the lengthy casualty lists that appeared in their newspapers. And although Anzac Day, the anniversary of that first conflict, doesn't mark a military triumph, for us as New Zealanders and Australians, it reminds us of a very important episode in our shared history. Great suffering was caused to two small countries by the loss of so many of its young men. But the Gallipoli campaign showcased attitudes and attributes such as bravery, tenacity, practicality, ingenuity, loyalty to king and comrades that helped New Zealand and Australia define themselves as nations, even as they fought unquestionably on the other side of the world in the name of the British Empire. After Gallipoli, I think it's fair to say that New Zealand and Australia had a greater confidence in their distinct identities and a greater pride in the international contribution they could make. The mutual respect, no doubt, earned during the fighting formed the basis of the very close ties between our two great nations that continues until this day. Australian's official war historian Charles Bean wrote, "Anzac stood and still stands for reckless valour in a good cause, for enterprise, resourcefulness, fidelity, comradeship, and endurance that will never own defeat." And it appeared to me in some of my reading that the nurses that cared for these wounded Anzacs were every bit as brave as the men. They too were cold, tired, and under attack. Little wonder that the Anzacs referred to these nurses as their frontline angels. The nurses were often working in remote and dangerous places under difficult conditions, and such services clearly did not come without a cost. Some nurses were never to return home, losing their lives to disease or at the hands of the enemy. And for all, I'm sure, the memories of long hours with wounded or dying patients were and are constant companions. This Anzac bond, which we commemorate every year on April the 25th, is a very special one. It was forged in World War I, but it continued to grow down the years through our shared efforts in theatres of war, but also in times of peacekeeping. In 2001, the New Zealand government gifted to the people of Australia an Anzac memorial that stands in Canberra. It symbolises the Anzac experience and is still, in my belief, one of the most evocative links between our two countries. The memorial serves as a reminder of the long history of cooperation between the two nations and the close relationship that we enjoy. The design of the memorial is a bronze representation of the handles of a flax basket. Woven flax is a particularly strong element of New Zealand's cultural history, and the design is based on a traditional Māori proverb, Mau tēnā kiwai o te kete maku tēnei, which means each of us at the handle of a basket. The proverb concerns sharing of responsibility and joint effort to achieve a common goal, and the basket handles symbolise cooperation, mutual experience, and sharing the load. Now, I find this symbolism really powerful, and while it applies in this instance to the relationship between our two nations, it seems to me to be equally applicable to the shared experiences of nurses and other service personnel, where those same attributes of cooperation, mutual experience, and sharing the load would have been and continue to be paramount to the success and the safety of all. As we look back on our shared history, it's important we remember all those who were impacted by the trials of war. And whether we think of those nurses who have paid the ultimate price during conflict, or the innumerable other Anzac nurses whose lives were forever changed by their experiences, it is important their stories are told, their achievements are acknowledged, and their sacrifices recognised. As we look to the future, the role of nurses in times of war such as those who have served or are serving currently in places like Afghanistan, in times of peace, such as the earthquakes Christchurch have experienced or the floods and bushfires that too often ravage Australia, nurses will remain critical to the fabric of our society. I thank you all for being part of both that history and that future. Thank you.